The kids are learning formal language in a very formal kind of way, but they're also composing in the old language a little bit. They come up with their own names. They're doing a lot of artwork at the same time. They're learning scribal handwriting from the 6th century. I mean, they're juggling a lot of stuff, and so it's fun, but it's really busy. One of the things that's really the focal point for this class is that, although it's sort of ahistorical, is basically we're working towards presenting a play version of the poem Beowulf. So we've been working to a point where they have a sense of how to pronounce the language. It's a very different sounding language than modern English, and how to translate it through. But they are also now, just today we worked out who was going to play Beowulf, who was going to play the monster, and so forth. And we're going to start blocking that out. We'll be performing it for another class, and also at a sort of a pseudo-reconstructed Viking village several miles west of here. So there's this sort of performance anxiety, and you know, it's like a drama class, it's a language class, it's an art class. There's a lot going on.
Sure. Ask
somebody, you know, your average smart 14-year-old, do you want to learn a dead language that doesn't even have the cachet of being like a college class normally, that isn't going to help you get into medical school, and unlike Latin, for example. You know, it's hard to sort of sell this in a sense, but there's the official way that a lot of people come into it, is that an awful lot of them have an interest in J.R.R. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, and The Hobbit. And Tolkien himself was an Anglo-Saxonist. He was a formally trained Cambridge or Oxford, one or the other, Anglo-Saxonist, and an awful lot of his words that he uses, the names in those stories, are directly culled from Anglo-Saxon literature. The story of the Hobbit is essentially almost a plagiarism from Beowulf in many ways. So the kids have an interest that comes in that direction. If they're interested in fantasy literature of various sorts, then a lot of them have come into it from that direction. And then there's the kids who are genuinely interested in warfare, and this was a warrior culture. This was a culture that spent a lot of time talking about who are our allies and who are the people we need to kill and how do we maintain our borders, and the history is very exciting as well. So there's that kind of angle as well. There are a few people who have the idea, which surprised me, but they're right, that learning Old English will help them to be better at modern English, and this is my subterranean argument. But the reality is that at least 4 or 5 of the kids said precisely that, and I thought, huh, how'd you know? So that's pretty fun too. Well, in terms of campus, we're waiting for the rain to stop, you know, and but mostly it's sort of walking around and coming up with names for, you know, doing games that involve vocabulary building. So sort of like talking about buildings in Old English, asking one another in Old English, you know, what's that over there? Oh, it's a big tree in Old English. You know, that kind of stuff, working on the grammar by incorporating it with physical movement and getting out of the classroom from time to time. But we're also dancing, and what we presume to be close to Old English dance forms. That's a little bit dodgy, but far less dodgily, they're all learning Old English script. And they really are enjoying that tremendously. And they're all making rune sticks, their names in runes, the very old Anglo-Saxon writing style. What else? They'll be making papier-mâché helmets for part of their costumes. There's a lot going on. Obviously, I have a love of this stuff myself. My focal area is 14th century England, 14th and 15th century England, but a secondary interest in Anglo-Saxon England, which is sort of roughly 500 through to 1100. So that's my own personal sort of academic interest. But in terms of like, why is this valuable to people who aren't going to become English majors in college, who maybe aren't ever going to want to do foreign languages, because I think that any foreign language you learn makes other foreign languages easier. The thing that I wouldn't necessarily say to the students, but that I'm quite willing to say just sort of generally, is that generally we don't teach people in our school system formal grammar. And formal grammar has a bad name as being a dull and boring thing. And generally people whose first language is English are usually pretty good with their first language. But when they make mistakes, they don't know how or why they're making mistakes, because we don't teach them the underlying skeleton of our own language. I am absolutely positive, and this is not just like an imaginary notion that I have, I've seen it happen with students, that students who study Old English understand their modern English in a way that they never did previously. They become better writers, they become better speakers. They have an understanding of how language changes over time, so that when somebody says something silly about, that's a rule, they can say, well, rules are meant to be broken, language changes over time. I mean, it just gives them a greater sense of ownership of the language that they use every day. But that kid is the kid who, you know, in grade 7 or 8, is is really bright and might be bored a lot in their regular school, or maybe if they're lucky enough to have an advanced class for students. But the bright kid who's generally under-challenged, because school systems have got to teach to the middle. I mean, I'm not criticizing school systems. We have, we have democratic education, and it means that you're going to teach to the middle range. Kids on both ends are going to often get lost, and the bright kids, what I think is one of the most, there's so many things that are criminal about anybody getting lost, but about a bright kid who could do well and maybe isn't doing well because he's not being challenged sufficiently. And so for that kid to be the one kid who's either bored and not trying anymore, or trying and being ostracized, or not being connected because the other kids aren't as talented as he is, for that kid to come to a place like JBA and to be among all the other bright kids and to be challenged and to learn that's like, first of all, I might not always get all the ideas right away. I might have to work a little harder. Most of these kids have never had to work hard to get ideas, and for now, I think for a lot of them it's this exciting sort of moment of, I feel in a way it's like intellectually like they're greyhounds that have never been allowed to run, and we're taking them off the leash and saying, let's see how fast you can go. That's pretty neat.
Yeah.
That's a big gift. What are we teaching them about learning that they can then take as a skill set back with them? And I guess that's maybe a backwards way of saying that I think that that's one of the best things that all of the JBA classes offer, regardless of what the content is that although we know that these are 12, 13, 14-year-olds, to a degree we are giving them the college experience, which is about, in part, being both responsible for and really proactive in your own education, sort of taking responsibility for when you're not learning something and demanding that you be given the opportunity to learn better. And so I think that just that alone is foreign, I think, to a lot of grade school kids. The idea that you can recognize that you're not learning well, and instead of saying, oh, I must be stupid or something like that, instead say, maybe I'm not learning well because the way that this is being taught, which is not to say that teachers are bad, but just to be able to say, I'd like to learn better. I'm not getting this material as deeply as I'd like to, so I'm going to go to my teacher and say, let's be colleagues in my learning. And I think that's ideally what college can do, is that the college teacher and the student are co-conspirators or colleagues in trying to generate this learning environment and make learning really happen at the best speed and intensity that it can. And for somebody who's 14 to get that and be able to bring it back to their grade 8 classroom and try to think of, how can I make my own learning experience a better experience? That's huge.